One of the hardest things I've ever admitted to myself wasn't that someone had hurt me. It was that even after everything I'd been through, part of me still missed them. That was incredibly confusing because logically, I knew the relationship wasn't healthy. I knew how much I had cried. I knew how anxious I had become. I knew how much of myself I had slowly given away trying to make the relationship work. There were days I questioned my own sanity, days I questioned my worth. Days I wondered if I was asking for too much when all I really wanted was consistency, honesty, and emotional safety. So when the relationship finally ended, I expected one thing: relief. I thought I would finally feel free. And in some ways I did. But there was another part that completely caught me off guard. I missed them. Not every day, not every moment, but enough that it confused me. I'd be driving down the road and a song would come on. I'd see something that reminded me of him. I'd remember a vacation, a joke, a conversation, or even just the routine of having someone there. And suddenly I found myself questioning everything. If they were so wrong for me, why did I still miss them? If leaving was so the right decision, why did it hurt so much? And maybe you've asked yourself those same questions. Maybe you found yourself missing someone you know wasn't good for you. Maybe you've even caught yourself wondering if you've made the wrong decision. Or worse, wondering if something you was wrong with you because you couldn't let go of them. For a long time, I thought missing someone meant I still wanted them back. I thought those two things had to go together. But eventually I realized they don't. And understanding that completely changed the way I viewed healing. That experience forced me to ask a question I had never really considered before. What was I actually missing? Because if I was honest with myself, it wasn't the relationship. I wasn't missing the anxiety. I wasn't missing the constant overthinking, the inconsistency. I wasn't missing questioning my own worth. I wasn't missing wondering if today was going to be a good day or a bad day. I wasn't missing feeling like I had to earn love. So, what was I actually grieving? At first, I thought I was grieving the person. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that wasn't entirely true. I was grieving what I believed the relationship was going to become. I was grieving the future I had imagined, the conversations I had thought we'd have, the life I thought we'd build, the version of us that only existed in my mind. And that realization was really hard because it meant I wasn't just letting go of a person, I was letting go of a dream I'd invested years into, a dream I'd fought for, a dream I'd convinced myself was still possible if I just loved harder, waited longer, and became a little more understanding. I think that's why so many women stay stuck, not because they're weak, not because they secretly want to be treated badly, but because they're mourning something that never fully existed. They're mourning the potential, the possibility, the hope, and hope is incredibly powerful. Hope can keep us hanging on long after reality has been asking us to let go. I know it did for me. For a long time, I confused hope with love. I thought if I could still see the good in someone, then maybe there was still something worth saving. But eventually I realized there was a difference between loving someone's potential and accepting their reality. That might have been one of the hardest lessons in my healing, because potential asks you to wait. Reality asks you to decide. Potential keeps you emotionally invested. Reality asks you to tell yourself the truth. And healing didn't begin when I stopped loving the idea of what this relationship could become. Healing began when I was finally willing to see the relationship for what it actually was. That changed everything. I think one of the biggest mistakes we've made is believing that missing someone automatically means we should go back to them. It doesn't. Missing someone simply means they mattered. It means they were a significant part of your life. It means you invested your heart, your time, your energy, your future. Of course, you're going to miss parts of that. That's what makes us human. The problem is when we confuse grief with direction. Just because you miss someone doesn't mean they belong in your next chapter. And I think that's a really important distinction because so many women judge themselves for missing someone who wasn't good for them. They think, if I still miss him, maybe I made the wrong decision. If I still love him, maybe we belong together. If this hurts this much, maybe I should have given it another chance. I used to think that too. But eventually I realized that grief has a way of making us remember selectively. When we're hurting, our minds naturally replay the moments that felt good: the laughter, the connection, the vacations, the late night conversations, the moments when we felt hopeful. What we don't replay as often are the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the tears, the feeling of walking on eggshells, the constant overthinking, the feeling that we were slowly disappearing inside the relationship. Our minds don't always give us the whole picture. They give us the pieces we're emotionally attached to. And if we're not careful, we start grieving the highlights instead of remembering the whole story. That's why I tell women all the time, don't let loneliness rewrite your history. Don't let grief convince you that inconsistency was intimacy. Don't let missing someone erase everything that made you leave. Because there's another layer to this. Sometimes what we're really missing isn't even the person. We're missing who we were trying to become with them. The family we imagined, the future we had planned, the version of ourselves we hoped would finally feel loved, chosen, and safe. We're grieving an identity, not just a relationship. And when I realized that, everything started making more sense. I wasn't trying to get him back. I was trying to get back to the future I thought I had lost. Those are two very different things. Because one keeps you looking backward, the other invites you to build something new. And that's where healing starts to shift. When you stop asking, how do I stop missing them? And you start asking, what part of me am I actually grieving? Because the answer to that question will tell you far more about your healing than whether you still think about them. Sometimes you're grieving lost time. You're grieving lost dreams. Sometimes you're grieving the woman you were before the relationship changed you. Sometimes you're grieving the hope that things would eventually be different. And none of that means you should go back. It simply means you're human. The goal of healing isn't to pretend those feelings don't exist. The goal is to understand what they are trying to tell you. Because once you understand what you're actually grieving, you stop looking for the answer in the person who couldn't give it to you. You start finding it within yourself. I think this is where many women start questioning themselves. They think, if I know the relationship wasn't healthy, if I know I don't want to go back, if I know I deserve better, then why do I still think about them? The assumption is that if you've truly healed, you should never miss them again. That if you've made the right decision, there shouldn't be any grief. That if you still think about them, it must mean you're supposed to be together. I don't believe that's true. I think sometimes we're trying to heal from two different losses at the same time. We're grieving the relationship that actually happened, and we're grieving the relationship we hoped would happen. Those are two very different losses. One is based on reality, the other is based on possibility. And possibility can be incredibly difficult to let go of because possibility doesn't have an ending. Reality does. Reality says, this is who they are. Possibility says, but what if they change? Reality says, relationship isn't meeting your needs. Possibility says, but maybe it will one day. Reality asks you to accept what is. Possibility asks you to keep waiting. And if you've spent years waiting for things to get better, waiting for someone to become emotionally available, waiting to finally feel chosen, waiting for consistency, waiting for the relationship you always believed was just around the corner, it makes sense that letting go feels painful because you're not just letting go of a person, you're letting go of the possibility that tomorrow will finally be different. I remember realizing that I wasn't actually holding on to who they were. I was holding on to who I believed they could become. And there's a huge difference between those two things because one is based on evidence, the other is based on hope. Hope isn't a bad thing, but hope becomes dangerous when it keeps you disconnected from reality. When hope asks you to ignore what you know, when hope asks you to silence your intuition, when hope asks you to keep abandoning yourself in the name of what might happen, eventually I had to ask myself a difficult question. Was I in love with the relationship I had, or was I in love with the relationship I kept imagining? That question changed everything because for the first time, I stopped grieving the fantasy and I started accepting the truth. And as painful as that was, the truth was also the beginning of my freedom. And I think that's where another layer of healing begins because eventually I had to ask myself a question that made me really uncomfortable. Who am I if I finally let this go? Not the relationship, the hope, the waiting, the wondering if maybe someday things would be different. Because if I'm honest, those things had become part of my identity. I had become the woman who waited, the woman who understood, the woman who gave one more chance, the woman who believed that if she just loved a little harder, communicated a little better, became a little more patient, and eventually everything would fall into place. The role felt familiar. It felt normal. I didn't even realize I was playing it until one day I asked myself, what happens if I stop? What happens if I stop waiting? If I stop trying to fix what I was never meant to fix in the first place? What happens if I stop carrying the emotional weight of two people? What happens if I stop believing that it's my job to hold this relationship together? At first, those questions were terrifying because if you spent years identifying as the fixer, the caretaker, the overgiver, the peacemaker, you don't just lose a relationship, you lose the role you've been living in. And that's why letting go can feel so disorienting because you're not only the grieving another person, you're grieving the version of you that existed inside that relationship. The woman who kept trying, the woman who kept hoping, the woman who believed that if she could just hold on a little longer, everything would finally be okay. And I want to be really clear about something. That woman wasn't weak. She wasn't foolish. She wasn't broken. She was doing the best she could with what she knew at the time. She survived the only way she knew how. But survival and living aren't the same thing. Eventually, there comes a point where you have to just thank that version of yourself for getting you this far. And then lovingly tell her, I've got it from here, because you can't build a future while living from an identity that was created just to survive your past. That was one of the hardest things I've ever had to accept. Healing wasn't asking me to become someone else. It was asking me to stop living. I remember one conversation with my daughter that I'll never forget. She looked at me and asked, Mom, why did you stay? I'll be honest. That question stopped me dead in my tracks because I didn't have an answer right away. Not the one I was ready to admit. For a long time, I told myself I stayed because I loved him. I told myself I stayed because I believed things could get better. I told myself I stayed because I wanted to keep my family together. And those things were true. But they weren't the whole truth. The deeper truth was much harder to face. The real reason I stayed was because I didn't want to face what leaving would require of me. Leaving meant starting over. It meant rebuilding my life from the ground up. It meant rebuilding financially, rebuilding emotionally, rebuilding my identity, rebuilding my confidence, rebuilding a future I had spent years believing would look completely different. That felt overwhelming because starting over doesn't just ask you to leave a relationship. It asks you to let go of the life you thought you were going to have. And if I'm honest, that terrified me. Staying felt familiar. Starting over felt uncertain. And even though I wasn't happy, at least I knew what my life looked like. I knew the rules. I knew what to expect. I knew how to survive there. I didn't know who I would be on the other side of leaving. Looking back now, I have so much compassion for the woman I was. She wasn't weak. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't choosing pain. She was afraid of rebuilding a life she had spent years building. But my daughter's question changed something in me because for the first time I realized that staying wasn't protecting my future. It was protecting my fear of having to create a new one. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it because I realized something even more important. Starting over wasn't what I was actually afraid of. I was afraid of discovering whether I was capable of building a life that was better than the one I was settling for. And that realization changed everything. And I think that's where so many women get stuck. Not because they don't see what's happening, they're aware. Not because they don't know they're unhappy. Most of them know that too. They get stuck because leaving asks them to grieve more than a relationship. It asks them to grieve the life they thought they were building, the future they imagined, the plans they made, the years they've invested, the identity they built around being a wife, a partner, a family, and that's an enormous loss. I think we don't talk about that enough. We tell women just to leave, as if leaving is simply walking out the front door, but leaving is so much bigger than that. Leaving is waking up one day and realizing your entire future looks entirely different than what you thought. When I look back now, I don't judge the woman who stayed. I understand her. I understand why she held on. I understand why she hoped. I understand why she kept believing tomorrow would be different. Because I was her. And maybe that's where you are today. Maybe you're grieving someone you know wasn't good for you. Maybe you're questioning your decision because you still miss them. Maybe you're wondering why, after everything, a part of you still wants to go back. I want you to hear this. Missing someone doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. It doesn't mean they were the right person. And it doesn't mean you failed at healing. Sometimes it simply means you're grieving the life you thought you were going to have. Healing isn't about pretending that relationship never mattered. It did matter. It shaped you, it changed you, but it doesn't have to define the rest of your life. For me, healing began the moment I stopped asking, how do I get over them? And started asking, what do I need to build now? Because eventually I realized something. I wasn't just rebuilding after a relationship, I was rebuilding a relationship with myself. One where I trusted my own voice, one where I honored my own needs, one where I stopped waiting for someone else to choose me before I chose myself. And looking back now, I can honestly say that rebuilding was worth it. Not because it was easy, because it gave me something that staying never could. It gave me myself back. If you're watching this and you're still holding on because you're afraid of what starting over might require, I understand that fear. I lived it. But I also know what's waiting on the other side of it. Not a perfect life, not a life without grief, but a life where you no longer have to abandon yourself just to keep someone else. And I can tell you from experience that life is worth rebuilding. If you're ready to stop repeating the same patterns and start rebuilding from the inside out, I've created Mini Reclaim for women who are tired of understanding the pattern but still repeating it. It's designed to help you identify the beliefs, patterns, and survival strategies that keep pulling you back into the same emotional experiences so you can begin changing them at the root. You'll find the link below. Start here because your future isn't built by holding on to what keeps you hurting you. It's built by becoming the woman who finally trusts herself enough to let go.